What would you do if the man you quietly let go for a reason you were never quite proud of turned out to be the same person keeping your own grandmother alive one sunrise at a time? Penelope Carter was about to find out, frozen on the sidewalk, staring up at a face she never expected to see again. The wrench slipped from his hand and hit the porch roof with a sound like a small church bell. Joseph Hale didn't reach for it. He was too busy staring down at the woman standing on the sidewalk of 214 Elmwood Street, one hand still on the door of a black Mercedes GLE, the other pressed flat against her chest like she needed to hold herself together. She looked up at him the way you look at a name you thought you'd buried. "You," she said. Just that. One word cracked clean down the middle. Joseph didn't answer. He turned back to the shingle in front of him, picked the wrench back up, and kept working. Because 8 months ago, this same woman had signed the paper that ended his career, and he'd promised himself he would never again give her the satisfaction of watching him flinch. 3 weeks earlier, none of this had happened yet. Rockford, Illinois doesn't wake up loud. It wakes up the way most Midwestern towns do, sprinklers ticking on in the dark, a garbage truck 2 streets over, somebody's screen door slapping shut twice before it catches. Joseph Hale had lived on the wrong side of comfortable for 8 months now, ever since Carter Logistics decided his services were no longer required, a phrase that still sat in his mouth like a penny he couldn't spit out. He was 36, 6'1", built like a man who'd spent a decade lifting things other people couldn't. Every morning at 5:12 a.m., before the coffee maker even finished sputtering, he sat on the edge of his son's bed and just watched the kid breathe. Leo was 8. He slept with one arm wrapped around a battered sketchbook the way other kids slept with stuffed bears. And every so often his eyelids fluttered like he was dreaming something important. What 8-year-old dreams that hard? Joseph touched the small scar above Leo's eyebrow. A bicycle and curb incident from last summer, the kind that heals on skin faster than it heals on a father's conscience. And whispered the same thing he whispered every morning. "Daddy's got something more important than work today, bud." It wasn't a lie, not exactly. It just wasn't the whole truth either. He kept his tools in the trunk of a 2012 Toyota Corolla with 158,000 miles on it, and every time he opened that trunk, his hand found the same wrench. First, the one with the chipped jaw wrapped in Sunday comics. The Christmas Claire gave it to him because that was the year they'd been too broke for real wrapping paper. He never grabbed a different wrench if he could help it. He knew it was a small, stubborn, sentimental thing to carry around. He did it anyway. That morning he crossed the street to number 214, where Evelyn Carter was already waiting behind the storm door in her late husband's gray cardigan sleeves rolled twice because they still swallowed her wrists. "You're early again," she said, holding out an envelope thick with cash. Joseph shook his head, same as always. "Buy something for your granddaughter instead." While he worked the shutoff valve under her kitchen sink, his eyes drifted the way they always did to the photograph on her hallway table. A young woman, standing between an older couple, squinting into the sun outside a church nobody photographed anymore. "Penelope doesn't call much," Evelyn said quietly, more to the coffee pot than to him. "I expect she's busy." Joseph said nothing. He knew exactly why Penelope Carter didn't call much, and it had nothing to do with being busy. He reached over to straighten the crooked frame, and that was when a second photograph slid out from behind the first, hidden flat against the cardboard backing for who knew how many years. What he found, tucked behind that ordinary picture frame, would keep him up long after the porch light went dark. It was a graduation photo. A girl of maybe 18, blonde hair, a gap-toothed smile. Joseph would have known anywhere, because he'd fallen asleep looking at that same smile for 11 years. Claire. Standing next to a much younger Evelyn Carter, who had one hand resting proudly on her shoulder. He already knew his late wife had once been Evelyn's student. Evelyn had told him herself quietly, the very first morning he'd shown up at her door with a toolbox and no real explanation for why. But knowing a fact and holding the photograph of it in your hands were two very different kinds of knowing, and for a moment, Joseph forgot how to breathe normally. What he had never told Evelyn, what he had never told anyone, was the deeper reason he'd chosen this particular street, this particular falling-down house, out of every neighborhood in the whole city. There was a message waiting to explain it, sitting unread on a dead phone in his sock drawer. He hadn't found it yet. Some part of him had been answering it for weeks anyway, without knowing the question. He slid the frame back into place before Evelyn could turn around. That evening, a text from the bank lit up his phone. A balloon payment coming due at the end of next month. The kind of number that turns a grown man's hands cold at the kitchen table, even when he still has a little time left to find it. He folded the unemployment check he still hadn't cashed and set it beside Claire's photo on the wall. The good one. The one everybody was allowed to see. Leo padded out in his dinosaur socks. "Dad, you got work tomorrow?" "Something more important," Joseph said again, and meant it a little more than he wanted to. He sat alone after Leo went back to bed, running his thumb over the chip in the old wrench. And somewhere 3 weeks in the future, a black Mercedes was already idling toward a driveway on Elmwood Street, toward a woman about to recognize his face, and a truth neither one of them was ready for yet. Why would a man fired without a fight keep showing up every single morning at the house of the one person connected to the woman who fired him? That question was about to walk right up the porch steps. 3 weeks came and went, and Joseph Hale never missed a single morning. He replaced every rotted shingle on Evelyn Carter's roof with lumber and shingles he paid for out of his own pocket money that should have gone toward his own mortgage instead. When Evelyn found the receipts tucked under her sugar bowl, she cried into her dish towel until her shoulders shook. "You didn't have to," she said. "I know," Joseph answered, and that was the whole conversation. Then, on a Tuesday that started like every other Tuesday, the black Mercedes GLE came back. This time, Penelope Carter's eyes were colder. She climbed out slower, like she was walking into a boardroom instead of her own grandmother's front yard, and when she looked up at the man on the ladder, something behind her face clicked shut, a filing cabinet drawer sliding closed. "Grandma." Penelope's voice was pleasant, careful, the voice of a woman who'd learned long ago never to show her hand first. "Who is this?" Evelyn beamed. "This is Joseph. He fixes everything around here, and he won't take a dime for it." Penelope shook his hand. Her grip was firm, the kind you learn in a conference room on the 41st floor, and for one full second neither of them let go, both silently confirming the same terrible coincidence. She remembered his face from a termination letter. He remembered hers from the wrong side of a boardroom table. That night, Penelope sat in her downtown condo with a glass of wine going warm on the counter and called a man she used to hire for vendor background checks. "I need you to look into someone," she said. "Unemployed, living off proximity to my grandmother, shows up every single morning." She didn't mention that every single morning had until 3 weeks ago been a phrase nobody could have applied to her. Joseph, of course, had no idea he was being watched. He kept refusing the envelopes of cash. He let Leo tag along one Saturday to water Evelyn's tomato plants, and the two of them, the old woman and the little boy, got into a genuinely serious debate about whether ladybugs were good luck or just bugs with better marketing. But somewhere in a downtown office, a folder with Joseph Hale's name on it was already 3 pages thick. That Saturday afternoon, Evelyn dragged out her old canister vacuum, the one with the busted wheel that made it sound like it was dragging a tin can behind it, and Leo, delighted, announced he was naming it Rattlesnake for the rest of its natural life. Evelyn laughed so hard she had to sit down on the porch swing, the same swing that had been creaking the exact same creak since 1987, and for a few minutes, nobody in that yard was thinking about lawyers or investigators or anything heavier than a broken vacuum cleaner with a silly name. It was that same week, late on a Thursday, that Joseph sat on the edge of his bed, charging Claire's old phone battery, long dead screen cracked in the corner, because Leo had asked out of nowhere if he could see a picture of Mom's face that wasn't the one on the wall. Joseph plugged it in and waited, and when the screen finally blinked awake, there was a draft text sitting unsent in the outbox. Dated 3 years back from before the diagnosis, had a name scary enough to say out loud. "I miss Grandma Evelyn so much. If anything ever happens to me, will you go be with her for me?" Joseph sat there a long time. long enough that the screen dimmed twice and he had to tap it awake just to keep reading the same 11 words. His wife hadn't told him. Not exactly. She'd typed it out at 2 in the morning, probably scared, probably not ready to say it out loud to a healthy man who still believed they had decades left, and then she'd never hit send. She'd carried that wish alone until the day she couldn't carry anything at all. He understood sitting there in the dark with an old cracked phone warming his palm. That he hadn't chosen this street by accident, and neither had she not really. Some part of him had spent the last 3 weeks finishing a sentence his wife never got to say out loud. One shingle, one shutoff valve, one Tuesday morning at a time. He didn't tell Leo about the text. Some things a father decides belong only to him. The investigator's first report landed on Penelope's desk that Friday. Hardware store receipts under Joseph Hale's name. 3 separate dated instances of Evelyn Carter attempting to pay him, and 3 separate refusals logged in careful handwriting by a neighbor across the street who apparently kept notes on everything that happened on his block. It should have looked like kindness. Instead, Penelope started showing up more Wednesdays than Fridays, then twice on a Sunday, bringing rotisserie chicken from the Jewel Osco on Charles Street, asking easy questions with hard eyes, watching the way Joseph moved through her grandmother's kitchen like he already knew where every mug and every spare fuse lived. What was she so afraid of finding? Or so afraid of not finding? Joseph felt it. He wasn't a foolish man. He started cutting his visits shorter in and out before Penelope's car could round the corner. But he couldn't stop coming altogether because Evelyn had started leaving the porch light on for him, even on mornings it wasn't quite dark anymore. And a man doesn't walk away from a light like that. The bank called again about the balloon payment, 10 days left. Joseph sat at his kitchen table with 2 pieces of paper in front of him, his own past-due mortgage notice, and an estimate for new double-pane glass to replace the cracked window in Evelyn's sunroom, the one that let the wind whistle through all night and kept the old woman up coughing. He paid for the window. He told himself he'd figure out the mortgage later. He always figured it out later. That Thursday night, a storm rolled in hard enough to knock branches into the street, and Thomas Reed, the widower across from Evelyn's place, a man who noticed everything and said almost none of it, watched from his own porch as Joseph Hale stood in the driving rain for 2 straight hours, holding a blue tarp flat against Evelyn's roofline with his bare hands, so the new shingles wouldn't peel back in the wind. Meanwhile, 3 blocks away, water was pouring straight through Joseph's own bedroom ceiling and onto Leo's bed. Thomas's security camera caught the whole thing, start to finish, time-stamped and clear as day. When Penelope finally watched the footage, because Thomas eventually showed her, thinking it would settle things once and for all, she watched a soaked, shivering man protect an old woman's house at the expense of his own son's. And somehow, impossibly, she still found a way to read it as calculated. People don't do things for nothing, she told herself, the same line that had never once failed her in 100 negotiations. She was almost right. She just had the reason backward. What she couldn't yet see, standing in her heated condo, scrolling through grainy footage, was a version of the story running parallel to her own. A man who'd once sat across a mahogany table from her without saying a word in his own defense. Not because he had nothing to say, but because some things, once you say them out loud to the wrong person, you can never take back. That Sunday before she climbed Evelyn's porch steps, Penelope Carter slipped a small digital recorder into the outside pocket of her purse. She didn't tell her grandmother it was there. What she was about to hear inside that house would either confirm everything she believed about Joseph Hale or take the whole careful story she'd built about him and burn it straight to the ground. Would the voice on that recording finally prove her right, or prove her wrong in a way she'd never recover from? She hid a recorder in her own grandmother's house to spy on a man who has never once taken a dime from her. Comment yes if that makes Penelope smart. Comment no if it makes her the villain of this story. The full report landed on Penelope's desk on a Monday morning, and by lunchtime she had already read it 3 times. Joseph Hale. Former fleet technician Carter Logistics terminated 8 months ago in a round of cuts Penelope herself had signed off on. No lawsuit filed, no severance negotiation, no angry emails to HR, No calls to her office, nothing. His checking account balance as of last week was $411. A man with nothing left to lose showing up every morning at her grandmother's house. In her world, that math only ever added up one way. She drove to Elmwood Street that same afternoon, and she didn't wait for pleasantries. "Are you trying to worm your way into her inheritance?" Penelope said it right there in Evelyn's kitchen, loud enough that the old woman's teacup rattled against its saucer. Joseph went very still. Not the stillness of a man caught, the stillness of a man who has been insulted before and has learned that the fastest way through it is silence. "Penelope?" Evelyn's voice cracked thin and frightened. "Don't you say that to him." Joseph looked at the old woman first, checked on her really the way you'd check on someone standing too close to a ledge, and only then did he look back at Penelope. "I don't need anything from her," he said. 6 words. He didn't raise his voice for a single one of them. Then he set down his coffee mug gently, like it was the only thing in the room he trusted himself not to break, and walked out the front door. Joseph's silence in that kitchen wasn't dignity, not entirely. It was the same defense he'd used the day they walked him out of Carter Logistics with a cardboard box under his arm. If he never explained himself, no one could tell him his reasons weren't good enough. Underneath the calm was a man terrified of being disbelieved twice by the same family. So he chose to protect the truth by saying almost nothing at all. Even though silence was exactly what made him look guilty. Evelyn didn't speak to her granddaughter for the rest of that visit. She just sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the space where Joseph had been standing. Evelyn found her voice again, once the screen door had stopped rattling on its hinges. She looked at her granddaughter the way she used to look at students who'd copied their homework and thought no one would notice. "You know what I remember about you as a little girl," Evelyn said quietly. "You used to check twice that the oven was off before we left the house. Twice every time, even at 7 years old. You've always needed to be sure. I understand that better than you think." She paused, folding her hands in her lap. "But being sure and being right aren't always the same thing, Penelope. Sometimes a person just needs you to trust what's right in front of you." Penelope had no answer for that. She drove home with the radio off, replaying her own voice in her head, "Worm your way into her inheritance," and it sounded for the first time like something that belonged to a stranger. That night alone, and furious with herself in a way she couldn't fully explain, Penelope went looking for something, anything, that would prove she'd been right to ask the question. She found her way into Evelyn's bedroom, into the cedar-lined bottom drawer of the old dresser, and there, underneath a stack of church bulletins, sat a small wooden box she'd never seen before. Inside were letters, a dozen of them, maybe more. All in the same careful, slightly slanted handwriting. Not love letters, not appeals. They were work reports, plain, business-like updates. Joseph had written to Evelyn every few weeks, the way you'd report to a supervisor, except he was the one doing all the giving. Replaced the flashing over the porch, no charge. Kitchen faucet should hold through winter. Let me know if the furnace makes that clicking sound again. Nowhere in any of them did he ask for a single thing in return. Penelope sat on the edge of the bed and read every one. Then tucked at the very bottom, she found something that stopped her cold. One of the cash envelopes Evelyn had tried to give Joseph, returned unopened, with a code scrawled faintly in fading pencil on the inside flap. E. 2019. She didn't know what it meant, not yet, but something about the handwriting made the hair rise on her arms. She was about to learn that E. 2019 wasn't a mystery at all. It was a name she already carried in her own family, and a debt none of them knew they owed. 2 days later, out on the porch, while Evelyn napped inside, 8-year-old Leo said something to Penelope that he clearly thought was small talk. "My dad says Grandma Evelyn is the last person who still remembers my mom," he said, swinging his sneakers off the porch step. "He helps her 'cause Mom asked him to, before she died." Penelope went cold in the July heat. "What do you mean, sweetheart, your mom knew my grandmother?" Leo shrugged the way 8-year-olds shrug at questions that feel too big for the moment. "I don't know. Dad doesn't really talk about it. He just does it." That single sentence from a child sent Penelope back to the archives that night, digging through decades of old faculty rosters from Auburn High School, where Evelyn had taught English for 31 years before retiring. And there it was, buried in a scanned yearbook page from a graduating class 2 decades back, student ID E2019, assigned to a senior named Claire Whitmore. Claire, Joseph's late wife, Evelyn's former student, 1. Evelyn, it turned out, had kept in touch with quietly for years, long after graduation, long after Claire married a young technician named Joseph Hale and moved 3 states away, only to move back to Rockford after the diagnosis, wanting more than anything to be close to the one teacher who had ever made her feel like she mattered. Penelope sat with her laptop glowing in the dark, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt something close to shame settle into her chest and stay there. She kept digging anyway. She needed to know the rest. What she found next didn't make her feel better. It made everything worse. Buried 3 folders deep in an HR archive drive, the kind of elevated access IT was supposed to revoke once a personnel review closed out. And never had she found the original incident file from Joseph's termination, the real one, not the sanitized version that had crossed her desk 8 months ago. It was the same drive where her own assistant kept backup copies of her board meeting recordings, the ones Penelope insisted on capturing for her own review later, a habit nobody had ever questioned until tonight. 6 weeks before he was let go, Joseph Hale had filed a formal safety report, flagging a mechanical defect across a third of the company's delivery fleet, a defect that, if left unaddressed, could have led to brake failure on the interstate. The fix cost Carter Logistics $230,000 in emergency retrofits, money that came directly out of the quarter Penelope had promised the board would be her cleanest yet. The termination paperwork that reached her desk called it performance-related separation. She had requested that language herself. She remembered it now, sickeningly clear, a 5-minute conversation with HR, barely a thought at the time, about how safety whistleblower looked on a spreadsheet versus how underperformance looked. She'd chosen the version that protected her quarter. She hadn't thought about the man attached to the file. She hadn't thought about him at all. What frightened Penelope most wasn't that she'd been unfair. It was how easily she'd done it without cruelty. Without even noticing the way people learn to protect a spreadsheet before they think to protect a person. She had spent a decade building a version of herself that never had to apologize, because in her mind, apologizing and losing had always been the same thing. Sitting there in her grandmother's chair, she understood for the first time that they had never actually been the same thing at all. Penelope sat down hard in her grandmother's reading chair, hands shaking so badly she had to set her phone down on the side table. For the first time in years, maybe since she was a very young woman, long before boardrooms and quarterly reports had taught her how to breathe evenly through anything, she felt too ashamed to draw a full breath. The man she'd accused of chasing an inheritance had, without ever once raising his voice, quietly protected the 2 most important truths in the room, an old woman who needed him and a wife who had loved her enough to ask him from the other side of losing everything to go be with her when she was gone. And Penelope. Penelope had built her entire case against him on the assumption that no one does anything for nothing, never once stopping to ask what a person does when they've already lost everything and still choose kindness anyway. On the side table sat the graduation photo, the hidden one. Joseph had slid carefully back behind the frame weeks ago, Claire's gap-toothed smile catching the lamplight. Penelope stared at it for a long, long time. She had the truth now laid out in black and white across 2 decades. The only question left, the one that would decide everything that happened next, was what in the world she planned to do with it. Somewhere across town in a dark kitchen he hadn't bothered to light, Joseph sat turning the chipped wrench over in his hands, wondering if he'd finally said too much or not nearly enough. Penelope found Joseph 2 days later, replacing a broken porch light at 214 Elmwood Street, like nothing had happened between them at all. She didn't come with the same voice this time. No investigator's careful phrasing. She set a thick envelope down on the porch railing next to his toolbox. "That's the compensation I owe you," she said. "For the termination. For all of it." Joseph looked at the envelope like it might be radioactive. "I don't need your money. I know you don't need it." Her voice cracked in a place she hadn't planned for it to crack. "That's not why I'm giving it to you." And then for the first time in longer than she could remember, longer maybe than since she was a college freshman crying in a dorm stairwell over a boy who didn't matter, Penelope Carter cried in front of another human being. "I neglected my own grandmother." She said the words coming out jagged, unrehearsed. "I built an entire company around never looking weak. And somewhere along the way, I stopped calling the one person who never once needed me to be strong for her. And then I fired you, a man who found a fleet defect that could have killed someone because you made me look bad in a room full of men waiting for me to slip. I was so afraid of losing control that I didn't care who I hurt to keep it." Joseph didn't reach for the envelope. He looked at her for a long moment instead. The kind of look that measures a person rather than judges them. "You're not a coward," he said finally. "You're just scared. Those aren't the same thing, even if they feel like it at 3 in the morning." Neither one of them noticed the screen door easing open behind them. Evelyn stepped out onto the porch, holding a manila folder against her chest like it was something precious. "There's something the two of you need to see," she said. "I wrote this 6 months ago, before either of you knew the other one still existed in my life." Inside the folder was a plan handwritten, dated witnessed by 2 of Evelyn's old friends from church. A quiet arrangement to bring Joseph Hale to live near her, drawn up long before Penelope had ever climbed out of that Mercedes and recognized his face. Evelyn had felt herself slowing down. She hadn't wanted to become a burden her granddaughter would have to carry on top of a company, a title, a life already stretched too thin. So she'd made her own arrangements. Quietly, the way she'd done most things in her life, without asking anyone's permission and without expecting anyone's thanks. "I wasn't trying to hide anything from you," Evelyn said to Penelope, her chin trembling, but her eyes steady. "I just didn't think you'd notice long enough for me to explain it." That landed harder than anything Penelope had heard in months. Leo, bored and fidgeting on the porch swing, had asked to play a game on her phone, the way kids always do, and instead, his thumb had landed on the folder where her assistant backed up all her board meeting recordings, the same habit Penelope had never once thought to explain to anyone. A recording began to play, out loud, tinny, through the small speaker before she could even reach over to stop him. Her own voice. Cold, clipped, 8 months old, pulled from a board meeting she'd have given anything to erase. "Cut the guy who filed the safety report. I don't need anyone reminding the board that I missed something. Handle it quietly." The air on the porch went perfectly still. Evelyn's eyes moved slowly from the phone to her granddaughter's face. Joseph said nothing at all. He didn't need to. The recording had said more in 11 seconds than either of them could have managed in an hour. This was the twist Penelope never saw coming. Not because someone else exposed her, but because her own past finally caught up with her in her grandmother's front yard, in front of the 2 people whose good opinion she suddenly realized she wanted more than anything else in the world. That was when Thomas Reed crossed the street, moving slower than usual, a manila envelope of his own tucked under one arm. "I've known since the beginning," he said, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps. "Joseph never told Evelyn he'd been let go, not once. He just wanted her to feel taken care of, and he figured the truth would only worry her." Thomas held up the envelope. "I've got the security footage from that storm 2 months back, time-stamped if anybody still needs proof of what kind of man he is. I don't think you do anymore, but I brought it just in case." Penelope shook her head slowly. She didn't need to watch it again. She'd already seen enough, a soaked man in the driving rain protecting a roof that wasn't his while his own son's bedroom flooded 3 blocks away. Evelyn waited until Thomas had said his piece, and then she reached into the folder one last time and pulled out a single sheet of stationery, worn soft at the folds, like it had been read and refolded many times. "I wrote this the week Joseph moved in across the street," she said. "I want you to read it out loud, Penelope. I think you need to hear it in your own voice." Penelope's hands shook as she unfolded it. "Penelope, I know you fired Joseph a long time ago. I found out on my own the way old women find out most things by paying quiet attention. I chose to let him stay in my life anyway because he is the only person left in this world who still remembers Joseph's Claire, my student, the one I loved best in 31 years of teaching, long before you were ever born. You stopped visiting. He never did. I am not writing this to punish you. I am writing it because somebody in this family needs to say the truth plainly before it's too late to matter, and I would rather it be me while I still can. Penelope's voice broke somewhere around the student I loved best, and by the time she reached the last line, she wasn't reading anymore. She was simply standing on the porch with the paper trembling in her hands. Every wall she'd spent a decade constructing coming down at once, in front of her grandmother, in front of Joseph, in front of an 8-year-old boy who had wandered out onto the porch and was watching all three grown-ups with wide, uncertain eyes. She knelt down in front of Evelyn's chair, right there on the porch, careless of her tailored slacks against the old wooden boards, and put her head in her grandmother's lap the way she hadn't done since she was small enough to fit there properly. She didn't say anything. She didn't have anything left to say. She just cried quietly for a long time, understanding for the first time in her adult life that she had already lost the thing that mattered most. Not her position, not her reputation, but the simple right to be called a granddaughter who had shown up when it counted. She wasn't crying because she'd been caught. She was crying because for the first time in years, no one in that yard was asking her to be strong. Every promotion, every hard decision, every unanswered call to her grandmother had been Penelope quietly running from the fear of becoming someone easy to leave behind, the same way her own parents had left her with Evelyn most summers and never quite came back to stay. Kneeling on those old porch boards, she finally let herself want the one thing her title had never been able to give her. Not to be praised for what she'd built, but to be forgiven for who she'd stopped being to get there. Evelyn stroked her hair the way she used to when Penelope was 7 years old, checking the oven twice, needing so badly to be sure of something. None of them spoke for a long time after that. Even Thomas stayed quiet, standing at the bottom of the steps with his hat in his hands. Leo finally broke the silence in the plain, unfiltered way only an 8-year-old can manage. He walked up and tugged on Penelope's sleeve. "Are you sad or are you happy?" he asked. "Because you're crying, but Grandma Evelyn's smiling, and I don't know which one to be." Penelope let out a laugh that was really half a sob. "Both, I think, sweetheart. Sometimes it's both at the same time." Leo seemed to accept that answer the way kids accept most things that don't fully make sense yet, by moving on to the next thing. He climbed up onto the porch swing next to Evelyn, the same swing that had been creaking since 1987, and let his sneakers dangle while the adults around him tried to remember how to breathe normally again. Joseph finally picked up the envelope of money Penelope had left on the railing. For a moment it looked like he might actually take it. Instead, he walked it over and pressed it gently back into her hands. "Put it toward that fund you're always talking about starting," he said. "The one for people who get let go and don't have anybody to fight for them. That'll do more good in the world than it'll ever do sitting in my checking account." Penelope looked down at the envelope, then up at him, and for the first time since she'd climbed out of that Mercedes weeks ago, something in her face wasn't guarded at all. The porch light Joseph had just finished replacing flickered once and then held steady, casting a small, warm circle over all four of them. The truth was out now, every last piece of it. What none of them yet knew was what it would leave behind once the shock finally wore off. Penelope took a month of unpaid leave, the first real time off she'd taken in 6 years that didn't involve a laptop hidden somewhere in her luggage. She moved into the guest room at 214 Elmwood Street and let her grandmother teach her things she should have learned decades earlier. How to make chicken and rice soup without a recipe card, just by smell and by memory. How to sit on a porch for an hour without checking a phone once. How to actually listen to a story instead of waiting for her turn to respond to it. Joseph still came every morning. Now Penelope helped, handing him tools, holding the ladder steady, learning the difference between a Phillips head and a flathead, the way some women her age learned it from a father who'd since passed. They rarely talked about the 8 months in between, the termination, the investigator, the recording that still made her flinch a little whenever her phone buzzed unexpectedly. Some things didn't need relitigating, they just needed time to settle. Like sediment in a glass left alone on the counter. What neither of them said out loud was that the silence between them had stopped feeling uncomfortable and started feeling like something closer to trust. Leo started calling her Miss Penelope, which somehow, without either of them agreeing to it, turned into just Miss P within a couple of weeks. One afternoon he wandered out to the porch holding his sketchbook, the same one he slept with wrapped in his arm every night, and held it open to a new page without a word. 3 figures stood next to a little house drawn in careful crayon, a tall man, a small boy, and a woman with yellow hair. Penelope understood exactly what she was looking at, and she didn't trust her voice enough to say anything back. She just knelt down and hugged him right there on the porch steps, and Leo hugged her back with the easy, unguarded trust that only children and very old dogs seem to have left in them. Joseph, for his part, finally accepted a job not at Carter Logistics, not anywhere near a boardroom, but at a small repair shop off Charles Street that Penelope had quietly mentioned to an old family friend who owned it. It was the kind of place where a man could bring his son along on a slow Saturday, let him sort washers and bolts into little labeled coffee cans, and still make it home in time for dinner every single night. He didn't ask Penelope why she'd made the call. She didn't explain. Some kindnesses work better left unspoken. 3 weeks into Penelope's leave, a lawyer arrived at the house with a folder that made Evelyn go very quiet. It was her official will. One she'd updated recently, it turned out, adding a single handwritten page that predated the whole misunderstanding by several months. If Penelope is reading this, it said, "Remember that the man who fixed my house never once took a dime for it. That's the biggest lesson I have left to give either of you, and I'd rather leave it to you now than have you learn it the hard way later." Evelyn Carter passed away peacefully on an early October morning, not long after the leaves along Elmwood Street had turned the color of the pumpkins already lining half the porches on the block. She died in her own bed in the house she'd lived in for 41 years, with Penelope holding one hand and Joseph, who'd come the moment the hospice nurse called, standing quietly in the doorway, out of respect, the way he'd always known how to make himself small in a room when smallness was what a moment required. The last thing she said, according to Penelope, was that the tomatoes needed watering. A small, ordinary sentence that somehow felt like the truest thing she could have left behind. A week after the funeral, Penelope and Joseph opened the cedar-lined wooden box together one final time. The one that had once held the work reports and the folded, unopened cash envelopes. Beneath the letters wrapped in a dish towel at the very bottom was a small brass key. It belonged to a modest one-bedroom apartment 4 blocks over, one Evelyn had quietly purchased and put in Joseph Hale's name months earlier, long before any of them had untangled the whole truth of who he was and why he'd stayed. It was, Evelyn's attorney explained, a gift she'd meant to give, whenever the timing finally felt right. She'd simply run out of time to decide when that was. Penelope didn't return to running Carter Logistics the way she used to. She stepped back from day-to-day operations and started something new instead, the Evelyn Carter Fund, built to support workers displaced by corporate layoffs with a legal aid line for anyone who needed to fight a termination they believed was unfair. Joseph became its quiet advisor, unpaid, showing up once a month to a folding table in a community center basement to talk with laid-off warehouse workers and delivery drivers who needed someone who actually understood what it felt like to lose everything and still choose somehow to keep showing up anyway. He never once mentioned his own story in any of those meetings. He just listened the way Evelyn had once listened to him. On the last afternoon before Penelope's leave officially ended, Joseph stood alone in front of 214 Elmwood Street. The porch light he'd installed still glowing faintly, even in daylight, a habit nobody had bothered to break. He had the little brass key in his pocket. He'd been carrying it around for 6 days without using it the way he'd once carried a chipped wrench for years without ever swapping it out for a better one, because some objects stop being tools and start being promises, and a man doesn't set a promise down lightly. The question wasn't whether he deserved the apartment or the fresh start or any of it. The question, the one that had followed him quietly through every unpaid morning on this street, was whether he could finally let himself accept something good without needing to earn it first, one more time, all over again. 1 year later, Joseph Hale stood in front of 214 Elmwood Street for the first time in months. A young family lived there now. A rope swing hung from the old maple, a plastic kiddie pool sat deflating gently by the fence, but the flower beds along the front walk were still exactly the way Evelyn had kept them, still weeded, still edged in the same neat little border stones. Somebody, it seemed, had made sure of that on purpose. Penelope's car pulled up a few minutes later. She stepped out in a plain cardigan, hair down instead of pinned up for a meeting, and for once she wasn't checking her phone before her feet even hit the pavement. They didn't hug. They just stood together at the edge of the yard watching the maple leaves overhead turn the same deep amber they'd been turning every October for longer than either of them had been alive. Somewhere down the block, a lawn sprinkler ticked on, right on schedule, the same sound that had opened this whole story 3 weeks before any of them knew each other's names. She'd have liked that they kept the flower beds, Penelope finally said. She'd have liked a lot of things, Joseph answered. She usually did. Neither one of them needed to say her name for the other to know exactly who they meant. Leo came barreling around the side of the house, 9 now, an inch taller, the gap in his smile finally starting to fill in with grown-up teeth, and grabbed one of each of their hands, the way he used to grab handrails when he was learning to walk downstairs by himself. He held up a new page from his sketchbook, still slightly damp with fresh crayon. 4 figures this time, not 3. Joseph, Leo, Penelope. And behind them, drawn faint and soft and pale yellow, a 4th shape, half transparent, like sunlight through a curtain. I drew Mom in the back, Leo said matter-of-factly, like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. 'Cause she's happy too, I can just tell. Joseph looked at the drawing for a long moment. And then he looked at Penelope, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he smiled. Not the tired, polite smile he'd worn through 8 months of unemployment and secret mornings and a chipped wrench he refused to replace, but a real one. The smile of a man who has finally been given permission to set something heavy down. Penelope smiled back. She didn't need to be in control of the moment. She only needed to be standing in it. That evening, Joseph finally used the little brass key. He and Leo moved into the small apartment 4 blocks from Elmwood Street, the one Evelyn had bought and quietly waited to give at exactly the right time. Penelope came by most Sundays, usually with a grocery bag of something home-cooked, and she'd sit at the kitchen table and listen to Leo talk about 4th grade with the same patient attention her grandmother used to give her all those years ago, before boardrooms had taught her to listen for what people weren't saying instead of what they were. The Evelyn Carter Fund kept growing. Joseph still showed up to the folding table in that community center basement once a month, still never mentioned his own story to a single person who sat down across from him. He didn't need the recognition. He'd never needed it, not once, in any of it. One quiet afternoon sunlight slanting low through the apartment window. Joseph sat at the kitchen table, turning the chipped wrench over in his hands out of pure habit, the way some men still reach for a wedding ring that isn't there anymore. Penelope sat across from him, saying nothing, simply keeping him company, the way people learn to do for each other once they've stopped needing every silence filled. While she waited, she opened the junk drawer looking for a pen and found a small folded note in Joseph's handwriting, never sent to anyone, tucked beneath the takeout menus, just one line. "Thank you for opening the door. This time I didn't run." There was no long apology in that apartment that afternoon, no grand speech, just 2 people who'd finally learned to be still in the same room together, and a boy in the next room humming while he colored, believing, the way only an 8-year-old can, that the world was still mostly made of good people who show up. This story reminds us that the richest person in any room was never the one with the most money or power. It was the one who showed up again and then again, exactly when somebody needed them without ever being asked twice. Joseph never gave a speech about loyalty. He just kept coming back, one shingle and one Tuesday morning at a time. And that turned out to be worth more than any apology Penelope could have written. If you're sitting alone tonight, in a house that still feels too quiet, Don't wait for a grand gesture to bring life back into it. Tomorrow morning, before the coffee even finishes brewing, pick one neighbor you haven't spoken to since spring, the one whose newspapers pile up on the porch some mornings, and walk over with a simple question. Is there anything that needs fixing, watering, or carried in from the car? Bring your own thermos. Stay 20 minutes, no more, no less, and let that be the whole visit. Do it again the following week, same day, same short visit, without waiting for a thank you card. And if you're missing a husband or wife the way Evelyn missed her Robert, don't just tell yourself to stay strong. Instead, set his coffee mug on the counter every Sunday morning, the one with the chip nobody else is allowed to use, and talk out loud to it for 5 minutes while the pot brews, about the grandkids, the weather, whatever's sitting on your chest that week. Then, if a young father or a struggling neighbor down your street reminds you even a little of someone you used to love, help him the way Evelyn helped Joseph. Not with money, but with your time, your porch light, and a chair that stays open at your table. That is how quiet love rebuilds a life. Not one perfect apology, but small, specific kindness repeated on purpose until somebody finally notices. They are not alone anymore. Behind every tear-jerking script is a human heart that first felt the weight of real life. AI was only a quiet assistant helping shape the words, so that practical lessons about love boundaries and resilience in family could travel farther.